Hi, Joseph, and thanks for accepting to be part of this today here. And when we think about Joseph O'Connor, we think about NLP, we think about maybe NLP and coaching. So we're going from neurolinguistics to neurocoaching. Is this a divorce or is it a progressive move, or how would you explain that?
Well, I don't think it's either, really.
Okay.
I was certainly active in NLP, and NLP for me was a very useful kind of introduction to looking at subjective experience and the sorts of important skills that are needed for a coach. Looking at goals, looking at values, beliefs, structure of language, neuro-linguistic,
Right.
very useful. But for me, NLP was always looking for some application. So in coaching, for me, this is now some years ago, about 15, 16 years ago, I found in coaching the perfect way to apply what I knew in NLP to helping people, to helping people be the best they can be. Now, of course, coaching is not NLP. But many of the NLP skills and perspectives are very useful in coaching.
Right.
So I took those, I integrated and added a lot of other things, and we built our own methodology. And of course, in coaching, you cannot ignore the brain. Although I've got to say, in the past, many coaches have. They've kind of taken, maybe all psychologists have to an extent, they've taken the subjective realm, the subjective perspective of what the person says and their consciousness and experience as spoken by the client, as something to work with. Now, that's fine. However, it's very important to remember that behind that is this amazing I don't know quite what word to say. This amazing part of us, which generates and not exactly controls, but it certainly generates and modulates and expresses all of the things that we do. So, like I'm talking to you. However, there is one part of my brain that happens to be able to control speech. Now, I think what's extremely interesting is that there's a whole other parts of the brain that do not have access to speech, but are very important as well. They have something to say.
Right.
And it seems to me that if you pay attention only to what the client reports in speech, you're paying attention only to a very small part of their experience.
That's right.
So you need to add the extra perspective of the brain, the neuro, the biological, the matter that underpins this amazing flame of consciousness that we have in order to fully understand people.
Yeah, can we say maybe, Joseph, that the coach can benefit a lot if he or she can coach the coachee thinking with the brain mind, and most of all the coachee is gets a good benefit of that. But how can we briefly explain that for coaches, for example? Why is for coaches or therapists maybe too, no? How can, if we know the basics of the neuroscience and how the brain works, mainly when we're looking for changes, how can the professional benefit of this knowledge?
Well, obvious ones are that our subjective experience, as we experience it and as we want to experience it, is kind of limitless. So, we say, we are going to do this, or we are going to carry out this task, we are going to be able to do this talking, we are going to be able to change our lives. And this is only one part of your brain talking. It's just like on New Year's Eve, there's one part of us that says, yes, we're going to make all these New Year's resolutions, and we're going to give up chocolate and go to the gym. And then on the 1st of January in the morning, there's a whole other part of your brain which comes into force and says, I don't know who was talking last night, but that wasn't us. So we are divided. We're kind of in a way fully functioning schizophrenics. There are different parts of us. It's about integration. It's not about having one part override all of the others. So that's one thing. I think it's important for coaches and clients to be humble insofar as their own experience and dealing with other people's experience.
Yes.
We only have access to a very small channel of everything that's going on, and there's arguably we're only aware of it after it's happened. So there's plenty of research that says things go on in the brain, and then we become aware of it. So I think it's fascinating. The most to answer your practical question, I think there are a couple of very important things that we don't pay enough attention to as coaches. And one is certainly the physical aspect, because whatever people want to do, and however they want to be their best selves, okay, they are not going to be their best selves unless, for example, they've had enough sleep.
Right.
because
yes.
because the brain needs sleep. We know this. We know that if we consistently don't sleep enough, we do not think well, however much we would want to. So for many people, especially executives, working late, getting up early, and not having enough sleep, giving up their home life for work, this is counterproductive. It doesn't actually help them do any better. In fact, it may make it even worse.
Right.
So, there's one very simple thing. The other is water. People don't drink enough water. The brain needs water. It's mostly water. So we need these things, and these are exactly the sort of things that our conscious mind, in its hubris, in its pride at thinking that it's the master, thinks they can do without, and we can't. The third aspect, I think, is the whole issue around neuroplasticity, which means that the thoughts that we have can actually change the biological material structure of the brain, which is an incredible thing to for me, it's just amazing that two areas interact. Our thoughts, which have no material aspect to themselves as they are, we become aware of them, and you can't weigh them. They're not there in the material world, and yet those thoughts, and more importantly, the persistent habitual thinking of certain thoughts, will wire together certain neurons in the brain, and this will lead to those thoughts becoming more habitual.
Right.
So thought affects brain structure, as of course brain structure affects thought. If you damage the brain, if you do something to the brain, there will be certain changes in your thinking, and however much you may not want that, that is going to happen.
Right.
So, there's the old Hebb's law, what's called Hebb's law, which is those neurons that wire together, fire together, and those neurons that wire together. So when you habitually put together certain thoughts and actions, then the brain connections actually get wired in, and it becomes easy. So this, for me, means be very, very careful about what sort of habits you form. And not just habits in terms of what we do, which is how we tend to think of habits of action, but habits of thinking.
Right.
One thought leads to another. Now, if you habitually think one thought followed by another, I can't do this, I'm no good. This is going to wire in those particular connections that will mean every time you think, I can't do this, it's going to lead to that generalization.
Right.
But looking at neuroscience, actually know how this happens, and then we can do something about it. We can actually understand the full structure of how this happens, and not just tell people, well, that's not true, don't think that.
Right.
Because they do.
Right.
That's the second aspect. And the third aspect is around mindfulness, which I think is extremely important.
Yes.
Because there is so much research coming out now,
it's beautiful,
based on plasticity, that mindfulness changes the brain in ways that we would very much want, in terms of being able to focus more, in terms of being able to have more space for thinking, in terms of being able to be more calm. So again, for me as a coach, I would say that some kind of practice of mindfulness is not just some kind of weird 60s psychological thing that you're supposed to do, or only people who are ill do it. It's absolutely essential to get your brain working well. And if your brain works well, then your thinking will work well. We value, not in all cultures, but in many, cognition, so that coaching can be quite kind of cognitive, quite wordy. We talk about things, and that's fine. But it's important to remember that cognition and emotion will always go together. You always have emotion when you have thinking. You always have thinking when you have emotion. It's not like you have to control emotion in order to think well. They go together. And the most the favourite hypothesis at the moment, I think, is called Damasio's somatic marker in terms of emotion. That coaching can be very wordy, it can be very cognitive. We talk a lot about things and emotions, and it's important to remember that emotions and cognition always go together. You don't have emotions without thinking. You don't have thinking without emotions.
That's correct,
So, and in fact, there's a strong argument that says we need emotion to make decisions, because logically and cognitively on its own, we can't do it. You can prove anything with logic. You can marshal lots and lots of arguments and one thing or the other. The feeling that comes from the body, an emotional feeling about what's right and what isn't right, in order to validate these particular thoughts. So what seems to happen is that in the brain, certainly we generate our thoughts and our arguments, but then they get integrated and weighed up in the front of the brain here, in the orbital frontal cortex here, and they get weighed according to the kind of emotional associations that we have with those particular ideas, situations, people. And then each idea gets an emotional weight, and the emotional weight will decide which way we want to go, which is why you can get some decisions that are totally irrational. They're not rational, but they can be fine. And there are plenty of experiments too with people who have damage to this particular area that integrates thinking and emotion, where they cannot make decisions, not even the simplest of decisions. They don't know what to have for breakfast. They don't know what clothes to wear, because there are so many possibilities. You can spend half an hour in front of your wardrobe selecting what shirt to put on. Because they're all the same logically, You need that emotion, and there are many experiments like that. People with damage to that part of the brain, they're more impulsive. They don't make good decisions. You need that integration. So once again, it's an integration of emotion and thinking that works. Not trying to control your emotions in order to think better. That doesn't work at all. Equally, there's definite evidence in terms of research that if you try to suppress emotions, or if you try to suppress thoughts, it actually makes them worse. And you can see this in the measurements, in the PET scans and the fMRI. You can see how emotional suppression doesn't work actually at all. What does work is what we would call reframing, which is taking the emotion and making it mean something else. So again, this kind of integration. So there's areas around emotional regulation and how to make the most of your emotions, which feeds into emotional intelligence and leadership. That's very important.
So as neuroscientists state, we have a social brain, yes, and I would say this is of great importance when we interact with others. And talking about this context of coaching, how coach and coachee during conversation, they activate these mirror neurons, and I believe that this is of great importance. How can we explain, or how would you explain the implications of these kind of neurons for coaches during the session?
Well, mirror neurons are basically, it seems like we have them in various parts of the brain, and they fire when we see someone do something, even though we don't through it ourselves. So we're kind of connected with others. It's how we learn. You could say it's how we learn. We watch people do something, and the neurons fire in our brain in kind of sympathy. So what does this mean in practice? Rapport and connection with other people is natural. It's not something that you have to work at or put on. On the other hand, it's also possible that people who have some damage to mirror neuron system are going to find this more difficult than others. So it also means that the sorts of behaviors that we do as coaches, facial expressions, body language, all this sort of thing, is going to be picked up by our client and reacted upon, kind of unconsciously. But the results of that will become evident. So, for example, if our body language, our voice tone, the words that we say, and there are, all of these have fairly strong correlates, and it's been being studied quite a lot in terms of what sort of conversations help people, what sort of body language, what sort of emotional expressions, then people will feel more at ease, and they will be feeling more at ease and less anxious and less threatened. They will be able to think more clearly. We know very much that when people feel threatened or anxious, the signals from the amygdala tend to drown and make it more difficult for people to think. So in terms of that natural connection with other people, it's very important to know that this is going on all the time. And that what we do is affecting other people emotionally.
There's this guy that it's called David Rock, who has a model that I really like called ARIA. ARIA standing as awareness, reflection, illumination, and action, motivation. And what he says is that the energy of having a vision is what drives a person to overcome fear of change. And what he postulates is that it's very important that the coach stays on the side, not on the way, of this vision or this insight that the coach is having. So as coaches, we know, that many times fear might get in the way, even though the person is very interested on that change, is desirable for this person. So would you like to add any, neuroscientific tip for coaches to support the clients to overcome fear?
If we're talking neuroscience in terms of how does the brain support those, and what can you do in practice to make those happen, which of course are all very important, then we have another conversation. And again, it's a fascinating one, because we know that there are connections, but we don't really know what they are. So, what is awareness? We're aware. At the same time, we have no idea how the brain does this, or what we could do to be more aware, for example. All we know is that, every 16 or 18 hours or so, or every 10 or 12 with some of us, we get sleepy. And we go to sleep and we lose consciousness and we lose awareness, and there's nothing we can do about that. And in fact, if we don't do that, we end up crazy. So just following that line of thought, you have to respect the neuroscientific kind of underpinnings of awareness, and treat the brain in a friendly way, so that you can make sure that you are just as aware as you can keep your awareness, and that means taking care of yourself physically in various sorts of ways. So from a neuroscientific point of view, there is lots of very boring things that you could do to make sure that you're aware. Reflection. What was the other? Reflection, insight and
awareness.
action.
Awareness is talks about awareness in terms of maybe I am aware that I have a dilemma, no? Maybe, for example, I want to improve my job position, but that will mean that I have to work many hours and travel a lot. But I also want to take care of my physical condition. Yeah, so this is for the person realizes it has a dilemma, no? Is aware of this dilemma, no? So then it's
Sure. Sure. Well, no, you've got to be aware of anything before you can do anything about it.
exactly, yeah.
This does seem to have correlates in the brain in terms of activation of the insula, but it's not like you can do anything about that directly.
No.
What you can do is, again, some kind of mindfulness practice that will, through neuroplasticity, over a period of time, again, if you do it in a good way, is going to increase that. So that would be one thing. The second thing, just thinking about reflection. I was thinking about this today. One of the greatest things that a coach can do is actually give a space for reflection.
That's right, yeah.
Especially for executives, they just don't have time. They are knocked from one decision to another, and they may or may not be good decisions. But to have time for reflection is priceless. And then if we factor in this thing about we seem to have two systems of thinking, two systems of decision making, system 1, system 2, and all the behavioral economics and stuff that goes behind that. System 1, of course, is the one where you just jump in straight away and you don't really think. And it's the automatic, default, impulsive system that we tend to use without thinking. And very often it's wrong. Right. It's not suitable for the kind of nuanced thinking, decision making that we need to do, because system 1 is highly contextualized. In other words, it is highly influenced by the emotional anchoring and the sorts of emotional reactions that we have to various aspects of the dilemma. It's also very open to framing in terms of the way that a situation is put. So, you put something, we're very loss averse. Our brains are loss averse. We do not like losing. If you put something in terms of this is what you're going to lose, this has a much greater effect on system 1 and the kind of decision people will make than if you put it in terms of a gain. This is why people will try to avoid a loss at all costs. And if they are going to make a loss, they'll do something like double or quits to get it back. In other words, they'll take big risks to get back a loss, but they will not take the same sort of big risks to make a gain, which is interesting. Yes. So that you have all these sorts of framing with linguistics, and of course marketers and people are extremely good at that sort of thing. You have the emotional anchoring and the personal characteristics and experiences of the person to start with. You have priming. All this really interesting stuff around priming. Somebody holds a warm cup of coffee and they think that the person they're talking to is warmer and more empathic. Right. Holds a glass of cold water and you ask them afterwards and they think that the person was maybe a bit standoffish and a bit cold. Right. You give people you talk to people about intelligence and they do better in trivial pursuits. Half an hour later. These things are fascinating and completely out of consciousness. We do not realize this.
No, that's right.
And this is, so our great awareness and consciousness and the fact that we think we're masters of our mind and all that we survey is just not true. We are influenced all the time by this context and by our environment, because the environment is it's real thing, and it has real effects on the body, hot and cold, and comfort, discomfort, and pleasure, and emotion, and everything else. And this is how the brain works. It takes that as input. Now, what you need, if you're going to do system 2, which a lot of these difficult decisions are going to need system 2, is you need to decontextualize what's happening. You need to be able to uncouple the concepts that you're having to grapple with from the environment in which they are presented. And that, for me, is one of the great skills of a coach, to be able to help people to uncouple their thinking from the kinds of contextualization that everyone is caught in. You know, we're all caught in it. We can't get out of it ourselves. It's like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And that's why we need a coach. What it effectively does is help people to achieve another order of thinking.
Yeah.
And then the intentions that come out of that, and I think that's a great word, it's much better than goals. And anyway, ARGA doesn't sound so good as ARIA. Leading to activity is great. So, you know, from the if we're looking neuroscientifically, we've got to go, what can a coach do to help a client from a brain-friendly way to help these processes? Because if we stay on the same level as those processes, of course, you know, we can do a lot, but we may miss out, you know. We will miss out on all that unconscious contextualization that's gone on for the client unless the client is helped to become aware of it.
Interesting. Do you think, Joseph, that learning the basics of neuroscience can make leaders more effective?
I don't know.
It's
it depends.
Completely irrelevant.
I mean, there's a lot. Depends. You know, when we talk about leaders, there's so much about leaders. I think that anyone who understands more about how real brains work with real people, rather than making kind of abstract models of how people should be or how they want them to be or anything else, is going to be an advantage in dealing with people. Especially in terms of empathy, and especially in terms of helping people to be aware and understand and connect with their own values of what needs to be done, which is what a leader does, after all. And after all, a leader needs to lead themselves first. And if a leader can't lead themselves first, then they're not going to lead anybody else. You know, if you can't follow yourself, you're not going to persuade anyone else to. So you've got to kind of inspire yourself. You've got to be able to know yourself. And the more you know yourself, the better leader you're going to be, I would say, as opposed to the sort of more instrumental leader who may be very good at getting people to do things, but then, you know, 2 weeks later, the people sit back and go, well, why did I do that? I didn't really think that was a good idea. Can't think why I did it. Well, what was happening there?
And same question with coaches. Do you think that learning the basics of neuroscience can make coaches more effective?
Oh, absolutely. I think personally that any coach that doesn't have some kind of neuroscience knowledge in 3 or 4 years' time is going to be at a disadvantage. But this is not about learning brain anatomy or
that's right.
Latin names for obscure parts of the midbrain. It's about kind of understanding that basic biological substrate, that domain of the brain, which you can't reduce consciousness to. You can't reduce our subjective experience to. You can't just say, oh, it's all electrical signals. It's not. It's more than that. But there is a connection, because neuroplasticity shows there is a connection. They do affect each other. So you're going to need to know some of these things about how the brain works, particularly around, you know, those sort of unconscious influences that we all have, and we don't like to acknowledge.
Great. Fantastic. So, I don't know, would you like to add something else about this conversation, Joseph? Or?
No, I know. There's a great quote, and I'm going to make it. Just let me see if I can find it here.
We can put it.
There's a great quote by William James,
yes,
the great psychologist.
Yes.
American psychologist.
Yes.
Now, this is nearly 100 years ago.
Yes, William James
1780.
is one of the first ones, yes, in history.
Yeah, brilliant guy. And I'm quoting here because I think it's very poetic as well.
Mm-hmm.
He says, nature, in her unfathomable designs, had mixed us of clay and flame, of brain and mind, that the two things hang indubitably together and determine each other's being. But how or why, no mortal may ever know.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think, well, we can say yes. Clay and flame, I think, is a beautiful description.
Very poetic, yes. Great. All right, that's a very nice way to finish this interview. So, Joseph, thank you very much for being here and for your words and inspiration. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Gemma. Thank you. Bye.